Hey folks, I'm going to do something a little different today and take a break from the heavy subject matter that I've been covering. So I wanted to show you the Vasa Museum, which I went to yesterday and was one of the most incredible things I have seen in my entire life. So I'll tell you the history of the ship and give you some footage from the museum. Okay, here we go. The Vasa is a Swedish warship built between 1626 and 1628. The ship was built on the orders of the King of Sweden, Gustav Adolf. When he acceded to the throne in 1611, he inherited 3 wars with Russia, Denmark, and Poland. Gustav Adolf was at war during 18 of the 21 years of his reign, both wars he inherited and wars he sought out. At the same time, Sweden was developing very, very quickly. Several towns were newly established, and the Swedish bureaucracy was born during this period. For decades, new ships for Swedish Navy had been built all over the country. But after 1618, Gustav Adolf began to concentrate on shipbuilding in just a handful of shipyards. So the most important of these was the Navy Yard in Stockholm. Men were recruited to expand the workforce, and the king embarked on a program of shipbuilding, hoping to add 2 new ships to the Navy every year, renewing and enlarging the Navy as part of his program of military and territorial expansion. Vasa represents a conflict within the Swedish Navy over how many warships should be used. Traditional officers believed that the deciding moment of a sea battle came in boarding and capturing the enemy, since it was better to take an enemy ship into the Swedish fleet than to destroy it. They wanted a ship which could carry a large crew, armed with pikes and axes, and cannons were only used to disable a ship and demoralize its crew. Gustav Adolf, who had been a keen artillerist, saw a future in which sea battles would be artillery duels. For him, the cannon was the primary armament, and so he preferred more guns and bigger guns. He ordered a number of ships like Vasa, big and heavily armed, but almost all of these orders were canceled after he died since they were such a huge undertaking, and the Navy did not really want these ships. Vasa carried 64 cannons when she went on her maiden voyage in August 1628, but 8 of the gun ports were empty. The Navy Yard could build a ship faster than the Royal Gun Foundry could cast its guns. The ship carried a large armament, but it also carried a large crew, 2/3 of them soldiers, who could man the guns, but who also could be used to overwhelm an enemy in boarding action. And I believe it was 450 crewmen on board Vasa. The amount of artillery on board was nearly unprecedented, and the king was not fully aware of the engineering issues associated with carrying such weight on board. The ship set sail on its maiden voyage on August 10th, 1628, and caught a small gust of wind nearly immediately, which pushed the ship so far over on its port side that water poured in through the open gun ports on the lower gun deck. It immediately began to sink. All but 30 of the crew and guests survived when Vasa sank. Most of the dead were trapped inside the ship. We only know the names of a few people on board, mostly who survived the catastrophe. The designer of the ship was an experienced and well-respected master shipwright who had built a number of successful warships for the Swedish crown. But Vasa was something new for him in its size and armament, and he had no way to calculate a proposed ship's performance in advance. The mathematics we now use to predict stability and speed were more than a century in the future, so shipwrights had to base their design on only their experience. In this environment, it was common that new ships, especially large warships like Vasa, were unstable when first put into service, so such ships were said to be tender or crank, and there were accepted methods for fixing the problem. Armament could be revised, extra planking could be added to the waterline, or the ship could be reduced in height by removing an entire deck. Unfortunately for Vasa, she was so crank that she did not survive long enough to be improved. The problem is that the upper works of the hull are too tall and heavily built for the relatively small amount of hull below the waterline, making it very top-heavy. This might have made the ship fast, but it put the center of gravity too far above the water, so even a light breeze could heel the ship alarmingly. This became clear to all when the ship sank, but it was suspected by some even before the ship had sailed. The fact that the captain allowed the gun ports to remain open when Vasa set sail was a very fateful decision. If they had been closed, water could not have poured in, and the ship might have survived long enough to be rebuilt in a more stable configuration. In the 333 years that Vasa lay on the bottom of Stockholm Harbor, the ship and its contents were subject to several destructive forces. first among which were decomposition and erosion. But organic materials fared better in the water, and so wood and cloth and leather are often in very good conditions in excavations like these. But objects exposed to the currents were eroded by the sediment in the water, so that they were barely recognizable. But human activity was actually the most destructive factor, as the initial salvage efforts, the recovery of the guns, and the final salvage in the 20th century all really left their marks on Vasa. In the 1950s, archaeologists found the Vasa and created a committee to discuss the details of raising and preserving the ship. A method was finally decided upon, and divers spent 2 years digging 6 tunnels under the ship for steel cable slings, which were taken to a pair of lifting pontoons at the surface. The work under the ship was extremely dangerous, requiring the divers to cut tunnels through the clay with high-pressure water jets and suck up the resulting slurry with a dredge, all while working in complete darkness with hundreds of tons of mud-filled ship overhead. Each time the pontoons were pumped full, the cables tightened and the pontoons were pumped out. The ship was brought a meter closer to the surface. So in a series of 18 lifts, the ship was moved from a depth of 32 meters to 16 meters, where divers could work more safely to prepare for the final lift. Over the course of a year and a half, a small team of commercial divers cleared debris and mud from the upper decks to lighten the ship and made the hull as watertight as possible. Never before had a 4-story structure with most of its original contents largely undisturbed been available for excavation. Still, the process for excavating was painstaking. The mud was removed from the decks with garden hoses and spray nozzles, washing it down into the bottom of the hull. As the mud and silt flowed away, it revealed an astonishing array of artifacts lying heaped all over the decks. The excavation continued for 5 months, and the archaeologists were working under heavy time pressure. The engineers responsible for stabilizing the ship did not know how long the old structure could hold the immense weight of mud and objects inside, which they estimated to be over 1,000 tons. They were especially worried about all of the mud and water draining into the hold, and eventually had to cut 3 large holes through the planking. By the time all of the excavation and diving was complete, over 40,000 objects had been found, including almost all of the parts of the ship itself, which had fallen off over the years. It would prove possible to reconstruct Vasa more or less completely, inside and out, with most of the remaining artifacts. So there you have it, a short little history on the only perfectly preserved 17th century vessel in existence. I hope I didn't bore you to tears, but thank you for watching, and I'll see you soon.